Hi there, my name's Danny. This is the second module of 10 that I'll be sharing on YouTube from my full course on Quasar Framework version 1. Welcome to this course module. So in a couple more modules we're going to get started with the course app Awesome To Do. But in this module we're going to cover all of the basics of Vue.js so that when we start building the Awesome To Do app you understand everything that's happening. So we're going to cover all of the basics such as how to bind the data in your data object to your view, how to respond to user events such as clicks and keyboard events, and then how to fire methods based on these events. We're going to cover how to show and hide elements, as well as computed properties, filters, directives, and much more. Let's jump back to the project we created before Awesome To Do. And we'll jump into the source folder and then the pages folder, and we'll open this index.vue file. This is a Quasar page, and it's this page here we see that just has this one image on it. Now you can see this page is just a normal Vue.js single file component. It has the three sections we talked about before: template, script, and style. And so the template section is where all our markup goes. You can see in this one we just have this Q-page element, which all Quasar pages have as their root element. And then within that we just have this one image. And then the script section, that's where all our data and methods will go. And the style section is where all our CSS styles will go. So let's just get this page ready for us to start playing around with some Vue.js on it. First of all, let's just get rid of this image. And we'll get rid of these classes. This style section, for some reason it's in the middle and it's typically placed at the bottom. So we'll just move that down to the bottom. And then within this script section, I'm just going to get rid of this name element because we don't really need that. Now if I hit save, you can see the image has now disappeared. This is one of the great things about Quasar, this hot reloading. So whenever you save your work, you see the change instantly. And this works not only in the browser, but also when you're developing mobile and desktop apps as well, which we'll see later on. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can bind data from your data object to your view. So to begin with, let's just add a bit of padding to the page. And one easy way of doing that is just by adding a padding prop to the Q-page element. Now let's stick a H5 on the page, a heading tag, and we'll stick some text in there. I love Vue.js. Now let's say we want to store this message, I love Vue.js, within our data. How can we do that? Well, within this export here, we need to create a data function which returns an object. We do that like this, data. And then within that we return an object. And this is where all of the properties will go for this component. So I'll create a property called message with a string. And I'll put the message in there, I love Vue.js. So how do we output this to the page? It's really simple. Let's just remove this text from within this H5. And we just use double curly braces like that, and then within those we put the name of the property we want to output, in this case message. Let's save that, and we now see the message on the page, but it's not hard coded into this H5, it's being pulled from this data property here, message. And now whenever this property gets changed, let's say we fire a method and that method changes this property, then we will always see the change instantly on the view. Now let's say we want the user to be able to edit this message property. How can we do that? Well, first of all, we'll create an input element on the page. Now we can bind this input element to this message property by using the vModel directive. So we just add v-model equals, and then the name of the property that we want to bind this input to. In this case, message. Save that. And you can now see the message inside this input. And whenever we change this input, message is updated straight away in real time. And you can see it updating in this h5 tag as well, in real time. Let's add a bit of interactivity to this page by using events and methods. Let's add a button which clears this field by clearing this message property when we click it. So we'll stick a button next to the input. And I'll put the text clear in that. Save that. You can see that on the page. So how do we attach an event to this button? Well, let's add a click event. We can do that by just adding @click equals, and then within these quotes we can just fire some JavaScript. Well, we want to set message back to an empty string. So what we could do is just message equals empty string. Save that and we'll see if it works. Click the button. That seems to be working. So now whenever we click the button, the message data property is set back to an empty string, thus clearing the input field and also clearing the text within the h5 as well. But what if we want to fire more than just one line of JavaScript when we click this button? Well, we can just call a method instead. So I'll enter the name of a method here. I'll call it clearMessage. So where do we put this method? Well, after this data function, we can add a new object called methods. And all the methods of our component will go inside here. So we want to create one called clearMessage. And then within that method, we want to clear message and set it back to an empty string. Now, because we're inside a method, we can't just do message equals empty string. That won't work. Because we're inside a method, we need to add this dot to the start of the data property that we're changing. So let's save that. Okay, that's still working. Except now when we click the button, it's calling a method which then clears the message data property. Now, we're not just limited to click events. We can add events for all the different JavaScript events, such as key up, key down, mouse enter, mouse leave, all that good stuff. So let's add a key up event to the input by just adding @keyup equals, and then we'll call the method. Let's call it handle key up. We'll create that method down here under the other one we created, handle key up. Now, these events in Vue.js will automatically pass the JavaScript event object to your method. We can access that by just putting a variable name for that in here. So I'll call it E. Let's just log that out. Console.log E. So let's see what happens when I press a key in here. You can see the event object here. So let's say if the user presses the escape key, we want to fire this clear message, thus clearing the message. So if I press the escape key while I'm in here and look at this event object, you can see the key code for escape is 27. So what we could do is add an if statement here. If e.keycode is equal to 27, then we can call this clear message method. Now again, if we want to call a method from within a method, we need to use this dot at the start. So you can just call this dot clear message. Let's see if that's working. Now if I'm in this field and I hit escape, the escape key, yep, the message is cleared. Now let's say if they hit the enter key, we want to alert out this message. What we could do is else if, actually first of all let's find out the key code for enter. So I'm just going to clear the console here, press enter while I'm in this field. Let me just log out E again because I got rid of that. Console.log E. Let's see what the key code is. 13. So what we can do is else if e.keycode is equal to 13. And then we can call a method. Let's call it alert message. And we'll create that method here. Alert message. Where we will just alert this dot message. Okay, let's see if that works. Hit the enter key and it alerts out the message, which is pretty good. However, there is actually a shorthand way of doing this. What we can do is, on this @keyUp directive, we can add a modifier. So for the escape key, we can just add .esc. And then from there, we can just fire clear message straight away. I'm just going to break this up onto multiple lines. And then we can add another one for the enter key. So keyUp dot enter this time, where we will call the alert message method. And we can now just get rid of this handle keyUp method altogether. So let's see if that's still working. I'll put my cursor in the input, hit the escape key, the value gets cleared. If I hit enter, it gets alerted. Pretty good. Now again, we can also use other events such as mouse enter, mouse leave. So just for demonstration purposes, let's just add a mouse enter event. So @mouse enter, and then we'll call alert message again. Save that. Now if I put my mouse inside this input, it doesn't work because I spelt mouse enter wrong. Mouse enter, that's it. Let's try that again. I'll put my mouse inside this input. There you go. We get the message alerted. I'll change that to a mouse leave event. Now when my cursor leaves this input, we should see the message alerted. Yep, that's working. I'll just get rid of this mouse leave event for now because that could get a bit annoying. So there you go. So how can we show or hide elements? Well, we can do that using the VShow directive. So one thing we could do is only show this h5 if the message is not empty. As in, if this message string here is at least 1 character long. First of all, I'm just going to stick a border around this h5 so we can see it showing and hiding a bit more clearly. So I'll add a class to the h5 called border gray, and then down in the style section I'll add a class for that, border gray with border 1 pixel solid gray. Okay, so we can now see a border around this h5. So let's show or hide it depending on whether anything is contained in this message string. So what we can do is to the h5 add v-show equals and then a condition. If the condition is true, then the message will be shown. If it's false, then the message will be hidden. So the condition we want here is message.length. In other words, does this string have a length that's greater than 0? If so, show the message. If not, hide it. So let's see if that works. Okay, so we can see the message now. Let's see what happens if we delete the entire message. Yep, the element disappears. Type a message again and it reappears again. So let's see what's happening to this element. So to begin with, when we have a message, it just looks as it does in our template here. Well, let's see what happens when we delete the message. You can see here it's added a style of display none. So in other words, the element is still on the page, but it's just being hidden using CSS styles. We saw that when we use VShow to hide an element, it just hides the element with CSS styles by adding a style attribute to it. But what if we want to remove the element from the DOM completely? Well, to do that we can use the vif directive. Now first of all, I'm just going to tidy up my code a little bit. It's a good practice to have attributes on separate lines because in Vue.js you end up with a lot of these attributes. So I'm just going to do that now. I'm going to stick a bit of space between the elements, and then I'm going to break these attributes onto multiple lines. I'm going to put the VShow directive before the class because that's more relevant to our application. Okay, so what we can do now is this VShow directive, we can just replace that with v-if. Now if we look at that in the browser, it should just look the same as before. So when the message is empty, the element disappears. However, if we look at what's happening in the inspector, if we look at this H5 in the inspector here and I delete the message, you can see it's removed the element from the DOM completely. So that's the difference between vif and VShow. Another good thing about using vif is that you can add an alternative using v-else. So in other words, if this condition here is false, we can, instead of displaying this element, we can display something else. So what we could do is add a h6, let's say, underneath the h5 with the message no message entered, and only show this if this condition is false. So to do that, we can just simply add v-else to the h6. I'll stick a sad face in there as well. So let's see what happens now when we delete the message. Okay, so the h5 disappeared and this h6 appeared with no message entered. Now if I enter a message again, the h6 disappears and we now see the h5 again. So we have this message property. Let's say we wanted to manipulate this message and display it somewhere else. How can we do that? Well, there's a few different ways we could do that. The first way is with a method. So under this h6, I'm just going to stick a hr there to break up the layout a bit. Then I'm going to stick a paragraph with uppercase message. And then we're going to manipulate this message, convert it to uppercase and display it here. So let's create a method to do that first. We could call that message uppercase, and we could just return this dot message dot to uppercase parentheses. And then if we want to output that, we could just do double curly braces, and then the name of the method, message, uppercase. And because it's a method we're calling and not just a normal data property, we need to add parentheses to the end of that method name. Let's see if that works. Okay, that seems to be working. It's outputting the message in uppercase. And if I change the message using the input, it's always displayed in uppercase down there. So that's great. The problem with using a method to do this is that every time the view changes, this method will be called. So even if something on the page which is nothing to do with this message changes the view, then this method will be called anyway. So just to demonstrate that, I'm going to create a little counter which has nothing to do with this message. So I'll add a new data property called counter. I'll set that to 0. And then at the top of the page, I'll create a button element. And within that, we will just output counter. And I'll add a quick style attribute just to position it up in the corner. So position absolute, and then right 10 pixels. Now let's add a click event to this button to make this counter increment every time we click it. So we can just add @click equals, and then we can just do counter plus plus plus, because remember we can execute a single line of JavaScript straight within these quotes. So let's see if that counter is working. Yep, that's working. Now if I just log out a message within this message uppercase method, console.log, I'll just log out message uppercase was fired. I'll just clear the console, I'll click the button, and now you can see it's logging out message uppercase was fired every time we increment this counter, even though it's nothing to do with this message and the message is not being changed, which isn't very efficient. So what we can do instead of using a method is using a computed property. Now, to add a computed property, we first need to add a computed property to our export here. So after the data and before methods, I'll add computed. And what I can do is just cut this method from methods and paste it into computed. So this is now a computed property. And now to use it on the page, it's the same as before. We just spit out the name of the computed property. But this time we get rid of these parentheses, because even though computed properties technically are methods, they're treated as if they're just static data properties. So we get rid of these parentheses, save that, and I'll clear the console. So if I now change this message and we look at the console, we see message uppercase was fired, and that fires every time the message changes. However, I'll just clear the console again. If I now click this button, we don't see the log anymore. So in other words, this computed property will only ever be fired when message is changed, which is a lot more efficient. Now there's one other way we can manipulate data before we display it to the page, and that's by using a filter. So I'm just going to create another paragraph underneath this one, and this time I'm going to put lowercase message, and we're going to output the message in lowercase here, but this time we're going to use a filter. So to add a filter, we first need to add a filters property to our export here. So I'll add that below methods, filters, and we can create as many filters as we want within here. So we'll call this one message lowercase. And so a filter is basically just a method which accepts a value. So we need to put value in these parentheses. And what we can do is just return value dot to lowercase. So how do we use this filter on the page? Well, it's a bit different from computed properties. So we still add the double curly braces, but this time we just put the original property name in here, as in message. And then to apply the filter we just created to that message, we just add type and then the name of the filter we created, which was message lowercase. Save that. Let's see if that's working. Okay, that seems to be working. It's displaying the message down here in lowercase. So even if I type all in uppercase, this message is always in lowercase. So when should you use a filter and when should you use a computed property? Well, with computed properties, you have a lot more power, generally speaking, because within a computed property, you have access to everything within your Vue instance, everything within this export. So for example, on the message uppercase computed property, let's say we wanted to append the counter to this computed property. We can do that. We could just add this dot counter, save that, and you can see it's on the uppercase message, it's appending the counter, and if we increment the counter, then it's also incremented on this uppercase message computed property. However, in filters, we have no access to the data up here, and we have no access to methods. All we can really do is accept a value, modify it, and then output it back to the page. So most of the time, you're going to want to use computed properties. But filters can be used for things like formatting dates. So let's say you have a date in a particular format and you want to change it, and you want to use that in multiple places on your page, then a filter would be better for that. So we've been using various different Vue.js directives, such as vModel, vIf, VShow, vElse. But in Vue.js, we can actually create our own directives to add functionality to elements. So we're going to create a directive which will auto-focus this input field when the page is first loaded. So in order to add a directive to an element, we have to first of all give it a name, and we need to prepend that name with v-. So we could call our directive v-auto-focus. Now we need to create the directive for this down here. So first of all, we need to create a directives object. Then within that, we need to place our directive. Now we don't add v- to the name down here, we just add the name that we used without the v-, so autofocus in this case. So I'll create an autofocus directive. And within that, we can fire a number of different hook functions, one of which is the inserted function, which will fire as soon as this element is loaded on the page. So inserted, and I'll just console.log out inserted, input inserted. Now if we reload the page, you can see it there in the console, input inserted. So once we're inside this inserted function, we can then do stuff to this element. So what we can do is we can pass in the L variable into this function. which gives us a link to this element, this input. So what we can do then is just add l.focus. I'll save that. Now if I reload the page, you'll see that this input gets focused. Now there's a lot more we can do with directives, and we'll do some more advanced directives later on when we build the awesome to-do app. But this just gives you an idea of what you can do with them. How can we add style to our elements conditionally based on stuff that's happening in the data object? Well, we can do this using the Vbind directive. So one thing we could do is on this input field, let's say we don't want this message to be longer than 22 characters. And if it is longer than 22 characters, we want to add a class to this input, which will change the styles to make it look like an error has happened. Well, first of all, let's just create a class for that. So down in the style section, I'll just create a class called error. And I'll give it a color of red and a background of pink. While I'm down here, I'm just going to increase the text size on this input and on this button, just so we can see what's going on a bit more clearly. So input and button, give it a font size of 23 pixels. That's a bit better. Right, so let's just see how that error class looks on the input. If I just hard code it in. Okay, so that definitely looks like an error has occurred. So how can we add this class conditionally? Well, we can do this using the Vbind directive. So I'm just going to remove this class and add v-bind colon, and then we want to put the HTML attribute that we want to bind to. In this case, it's going to be the class attribute. And then within here, we want to add single curly braces, and then the name of the class that we want to conditionally add. In this case, error. And then we want to add another colon, and then on this side of the colon, we want to specify the condition for adding this error class. And in this case, the condition is that we want the message to be longer than 22 characters. So we can just add message.length is greater than 22. Now I'm just going to stick a div underneath this input and underneath the button to show how many characters we've typed, just so we can see what's going on. So I can do that just by using double curly braces, and then in there I can just put message.length. Okay, so right now it's 22 characters and there's no error. What happens if we add some more characters? Okay, you can see the class is being added and the styles are being added too. If I delete the characters, the extra characters, the error class disappears. Now there is a shorthand way of using v-bind. We can basically just remove the v-bind bit, just leave this semicolon there. Now there's all kinds of different ways that we can use this attribute binding, and we'll cover that in more detail later. There's another way that we can attach style to elements, and that's by binding directly to the style attribute and using a computed property to generate that style. So I'm just going to delete this vbind class directive we've added and add one for the style attribute instead. And we'll bind that to a computed property called error style. And we can create this computed property down here, error style. Now what we want to do is, if the message is longer than 22 characters, then we want to return the error styles. So we can just do if this.message.length is greater than 22, return. Now we could just return the styles as a string, like this, color, red, background, pink. But a neater way that we can do this is just by returning a JavaScript object, like this. So return color, red, background, pink. Okay, let's just see if that's working. So there's no error message at the moment with 22 characters. Let's add some more characters. Yeah, that's working. Except this time, instead of adding a class to this import, if you look at the inspector, it's actually adding the styles to this directly in the style attribute. Now, generally, it's probably best to use classes rather than directly injecting styles. But there might be certain cases where you need to inject style directly, such as when you need to change the left or right position of an element or something like that. Let's talk about Vue.js lifecycle hooks. Now, lifecycle hooks allow us to execute code at certain points in the lifecycle of our Vue component. Now, the first one is the before create hook, and this is fired just before your Vue component is created. After that, we have the created hook, which is fired at the point where the Vue component is created. And that means basically all of your data and methods have been loaded, all of the markup for the Vue have been determined, but at this point, the markup has not been committed to the Vue, to the browser. It's just been done virtually at this point. Next, we have the before mount hook, which is fired just before the markup for your component is actually applied to the Vue, to the browser. And next, we have the mounted hook, which means the markup for your component has actually been committed to the Vue. So you can now see it in the browser. And this mounted hook is probably the one you're going to want to use most of the time whenever you want to fire some initialization code when a component is first loaded. We also have a couple more hooks which are fired whenever the Vue component view is updated. So let's say you click a button and that changes something within your component. Well, these two hooks will be fired at that point. First, we have the before update hook, which will be fired just before that update is applied to the Vue. And then we have the updated hook, which will be fired at the point where the Vue is updated. Finally, we have two more hooks which are fired when your Vue component is destroyed. So what does that mean, destroyed? Well, let's say you're on one particular page and you navigate away from that page and a new page is loaded into the browser. Well, that first page will fire these destroyed hooks at that point. The first one is the before destroy hook, which will be fired just before the Vue component is destroyed. And then the destroyed hook, which will be fired at the point where your component is destroyed. Let's add some lifecycle hooks to this page. So where can we put these lifecycle hooks? Well, we can just put them within our export here, within our Vue instance. So I'll add these to the bottom after directives. And I'll add these in the order in which they're fired during the lifecycle. So the first one is the before create. And I'll just stick a console.log in there so we can see it being fired. Before create. Now the next one is the created hook. Then we have the before mount. And the mounted hook, which, as I said before, this is the one you're probably going to use most of the time. Mounted. Now I'll just save that and I'll just reload the page. Now if you look in the console here, you can see these logs being logged out in the order we would expect. So first the before create, then the created hook, then the before mount hook, and then the mounted hook. Right, so now let's add the hooks that are fired whenever the Vue is updated. So first one is before update. I'll just log out before update. Then we have the updated hook. I'll save that and reload the page. Now you can see these two hooks we just added before update and updated. We can't see these in the console yet. But if I now click on this button and we look at the console, we can now see these hooks being fired. First the before update and then the updated. Or if I clear this message, then we see them fired again. Before update and then updated. Let's add the destroyed hooks. So first of all we have before destroy. And I'll log out before destroy. Then we have the destroyed hook. And I'll just log out destroyed. Reload the page. Again, we don't see these hooks being fired because this component hasn't been destroyed yet. Well, one way we could destroy it is to navigate to another page. Now, we don't have any other pages, but I'm just going to stick a random word after the URL because we do have an error page set up as a fallback. If I hit enter on that, so it's navigated away from the first page. And if we look in the console, we now see the before destroy and destroyed hooks. Let's talk about refs now. So what are refs? Well, refs allow us to access a particular element in the DOM and then either grab information from it or then manipulate it in some way. So let's add a ref to this input element here. What we can do is we can just add a new attribute called ref and then give it a name. So I'm going to call this one message input. Now we can access these refs once the view is instantiated. So I'm just going to remove all of these hooks we created before, with the exception of the mounted hook. And I'll remove that console.log. And we can access refs by using this.refs. So let's just console.log that out and see what we see. I'll just reload the page. Now in the console we see this log here. It's logging out an object. And we can see the ref we used before, message input. And that's linked to an input. If we hover over this input, we can see it highlighted in the browser. So if we want to get access to this particular ref, the message input ref, back to the mounted hook, we can just use this.refs and then the name of the ref, message input. So one thing we could do is set a class on that input. So we could just do .className equals, and I'll use a class bggreen. This is actually a class that's built into Quasar, which will give elements a green background. So I'll save that now. You can now see a green background on this input. And we can see the class there in the inspector. However, it's not a very good idea to use refs wherever there's reactive data involved. I'll just show you what I mean here. So this input, if it has more than 22 characters, we add the error styles to it. If you remember, before we applied styles directly, we actually just added this error class to it down here. So I'm going to put it back how it was originally by changing this style directive, this Vbind style directive, to a class one. And remember, to add a class conditionally, we specify the class name, error, do a colon, and then on the other side of the colon we specify the condition. And the condition was message.length greater than 22. So let's see what happens here. I'll refresh the page. You can see it's added this bggreen class. Just inspect that as well. You can see that in the inspector there, bggreen. But watch what happens now if we enter some characters. So it's now longer than 22 characters. So Vue.js has added the error class to it. And if we look in the inspector, it's removed our bggreen class. So in other words, the work that we did using refs has been overwritten by Vue.js. And this is something that's quite important to keep in mind. This is not a way that you would really use refs in the real world to add classes. You're best just using built-in Vue.js methods to do that. But some real-world ways that we could use refs include using them for form validation or for auto-focusing fields, a bit like we did with a custom directive before. And we will be using some refs later on for form validation when we create the awesome to-do app. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe and leave a comment to let me know what you think. And if you're interested in the full course, click the link in the description. In the next video in this series, I'm going to show you how to display lists of data using Vue.js, how to break your components down into child components, and how to pass data down to those child components.